I sincerely think that the series that we are starting tonight, in terms of its evaluative content, is really of considerable importance. And as you probably know by now, that in the usual habit pattern of old people, I always like to tell stories. So I'll tell you the story, which will be very brief and very boring, which is a good combination. See, if it's the other way, then it's out of kilter. Namely, back in the fairly early 1960s, I went with a Greyhound bus to San Diego to lecture, and I came back with a Royal Imperial flu, and so I was really quite sick. I had high fever and all of that. Meanwhile, I had also been conferring with a telephone friend, the late Larry Holt, who was a fellow Austrian. In fact, he was a fairly high official of the Austrian government before the Nazis came, although quite a young man, a very, very interesting man. And he was my literary advisor. Pretty much every night, right around midnight, when the ghosts come, he would call me on the phone and regale me about the latest books that he read and that I should read. So that was a great information. And the latest book that he was recommending to me was a book called The Hobbit by an author I didn't know anything about, by the name of Tolkien. So I had bought the book. I have, I think, the original copy that I bought here. I had a hard time keeping it together so it wouldn't fall apart when I brought it here. You know. In any event, that was the only book that I had near my bed. So I said, well, Larry recommended it. I might as well read it, and I found it a very charming and funny treatise, which in many of his chapters, as I went through it, always had sort of intimations of more and something else. So you always felt that this is all right, but there must be more. Well, that was quite true in the latter part of the book, and then fairly soon thereafter, the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings came out, to which of course The Hobbit was an introduction. So as time went on, and as I had all the books, initially all paperback books, but I still have the pages of some of them because I read them so much that they fell apart. Finally, I got a hardcover set, which now is falling apart also. So I imagine that this deterioration is not purely a natural process appertaining to the books, but that perhaps my frequent reading of for many years I read the whole trilogy, sometimes along with The Hobbit, beginning in September, because in September is Bilbo Baggins' birthday, and so that's a good one to begin with. You know, in any event, I became very fond of the books, and I had a number of young friends at the time who were very enthusiastic about it too. And so for quite a period of months, I had my little place down on Melrose Avenue. Once a week, I think every Wednesday, we had Tolkien evening. And it became known sort of in the neighborhood, and the people started coming. It was very enjoyable. In any event, since, as I say, even since then, my interest in the subject of these books was very great and still is. And so I have had talks about them before, but I thought that maybe at this time would be an appropriate time to take a look at Tolkien again and refresh perhaps our own memories and ideas of how this material might be of considerable benefit to us. And so I thought that's what we'll begin tonight. So who we are talking about is a now deceased Oxford professor of a branch of linguistic science, English, who grew up not in England, but in the town of Bloemfontein in South Africa. And I only learned that particular circumstance after I read some of the books already. And I learned them for a very, very beautiful young actress who used to come to us and who herself, she was British, she herself grew up in Bloemfontein. She lived there. And she communicated to us that the town was known for one curious circumstance, that it had the largest spiders of any place in South Africa. And so immediately, there is a considerable spider motif in the Lord of the Rings, so that's where he acquired that, including the little song of Bilbo to his first encounter with the huge Attercop spiders who are trying to capture his dwarf friends. Old fat spider spinning in a tree, old fat spider won't see me. Attercop, down you drop, you never catch me up your tree. And this, so Tolkien says, made the spiders exceptionally angry. And he said that apparently they really don't like to be called Attercop. I have tried that. I gave the Attercop test to numerous spiders, much smaller, that I encountered around here, but they didn't seem to be particularly exercised thereby. But certainly in the book they were. So John Ronald Reuel Tolkien grew, as I say, he grew up in Bloemfontein. He was an orphan, and his relatives who had some occupation in South Africa took him there for a number of years, and then later on he came back to England, and he was largely raised and mentored in his early years by the local Catholic priest, and who raised him as a very devout Roman Catholic. And it is said by his, it was written by his son Christopher, that his father, namely Ronald, had most of his adult life served the Mass every morning in the village church. So that requires quite a bit of devotion. I have served when I was a child in in a number of places, but never that frequently. I had to be in holy orders before I got to do that. In any event, he grew into, when he was a very young man, he grew to, I'm sure, to his amazement and occasional unhappiness, he grew into the period of World War I, and he joined the army and fought in several of the great battles on the continent, and eventually got gravely wounded and was sent back home to the military hospital. And as we have learned from some of his notes, which in turn were put in literary form by his very literate son Christopher, that it was about that time when he came back from the war, from the Western Front, that some curious incidents began occurring to him, which he really kept pretty secret. But then long after his death, in correspondence with some of the Tolkienian devotees throughout the world, it became known that such was the case. And the case I'm talking is that he began having interaction with usually invisible beings who also spoke with him, and in addition to imparting all sorts of interesting information to him, also taught him an entire language that nobody else knows, and which he came to call Elfic, and which also has various, because being a scholar, he had very precise definitions, and that, yes, well, this is this variety of Elfic, and it is that variety of Elfic, but he was very proud of it. And let us say that even though he did not reveal this, I think only to his son, who then put it in literary form, it eventually became known that the source of his work and of the great mythos of the Lord of the Rings was in unusual and transcendental experiences of Tolkien, which began when he was in the hospital after the war, and which, at least in part, returned to him throughout his life, including the fact that they taught him an entire new language that he did not know, and you might say an entire cosmology of vast and complex structure that then came to be embodied in, was foreshadowed in the little book The Hobbit, which came out in this edition, and that's really how it became very popular in this country. And then the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings thereafter, about which I hope I will say more as time goes on, which will make some sense. So I think he was present and was wounded at the Battle of the Marne, but there were a lot of big and bloody battles at that time, as you well know. And so he spent considerable time recovering, because apparently the injury that he sustained in the war was quite grave, and there began to form in his mind a an entire, how should we put it, an entire saga of vast proportions of what maybe in ordinary literature we would call an alternate world. Although it's only alternate to the extent that some of the statements and even some of the sub-legends within it are discernible in the literature of the Western culture, but not entirely, let's say, not entirely without links to another reality, but with links to our reality. And as it happened in the 1960s and going into the 1970s, 80s or so forth, it was the right time, and there are a good many people, especially of the younger generation, became very enthusiastic about Tolkien. Eventually the famous motion picture was made, which was shot in New Zealand, and I was looking forward to seeing the locale where it was shot. So sure enough, when I just got to that part of the country, all sorts of bad weather and earthquakes and things like that occurred, and I was never able to go to the New Zealand Alps, in the bottom of which is the terrain of the land of the hobbits, where the movie was shot. Then there were even some follow-up, at least one follow-up film behind that. So let us say all of a sudden everything was coming up Tolkien. And obviously the first, and he had been contacting his English publisher for years, and for quite a while they did not look very favorably upon this, what they consider in the genre of fantasy. Of course, not realizing that historically fantasy has been greatly and highly valued, and obviously was the source of some of the truly great literary works of the world, beginning certainly with the ancient Greeks and maybe beyond. But sure enough, eventually, after The Hobbit had a certain amount of popularity, then came The Lord of the Rings, which consists of three volumes, and I have an old edition of it here. As you can see, one of the volumes, even of the hardback edition, is falling apart, and it's not falling apart just because of bad construction, but rather because of frequent and vigorous use. So yes, the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Coming of the King. And I would advise that unless you, for some reason, are really put off by any of these, that try to read all of them one after the other. And of course, with one reading, you will only gain so much benefit, but more than if you haven't read them at all. So it's quite obvious. In any event, what I wanted more or less for introduction and to act as a bridge into other studies, psychological and literary, what I wanted to concentrate on tonight, and there I am, if that's concentration, but of course we started late. So in any event, and that is that we need to realize that Tolkien's world is a world that bears considerable similarities to ours, especially at a profound level, but is still very, very different. He even felt it necessary to write an entire separate book which tells the story, the history of Middle Earth. So when you are looking for maybe some of the references, and I love the references in The Lord of the Rings, because they always intimated to me that there is more. There is more. It's not just what's written down here, you know. It was absolute delight. It was the delight of my life for years. And as I say, for a while I was so taken with them that I passed the word to some of my friends who were for the most part quite a bit younger than myself, and so we had a day of the week. I probably intimated that already before. There was a Tolkien night, and anybody could come to my house, and then we discussed Tolkien, which was really, really very delightful. The only incident from that which I remember, and which I probably should not mention, but the way it is with me, when I shouldn't mention something, I mention it. So it was one young man, you know, this was the era of the 60s with all the demonstrations and all this sort of thing. So a young man came in to the, whatever we would call it, the class or so, and he was clutching a small book. So eventually, after he was in there, and we always served a cheap but potent wine, and so he was there, and I asked him, well, what are you reading there, sir? And he said, he showed it to me, and you know what it was? It was Mao's Red Book. So I think my face turned the color of the book when I saw it. So for a while I kept pretty quiet, and then I said, you didn't know that, but you don't bring that book or a book of similar content to his house ever. You're always welcome. We are lovely to discuss Tolkien with you, but I will not tolerate a book of the bloodthirsty communist in my house. Okay. So sure enough, at least one time I think he even still was carrying that miserable treatise. He put it down outside of my door. So I had a sort of several steps coming up and a platform, and from there you enter. So he left it out there. I told him afterwards, I hope somebody will steal it. In any event, just to show you how those things worked. But in any event, we had a very good time, and I could detect after, because we carried on these meetings for several months, it began to dawn on me that there is something in these books, whether you read it yourself or whether you are discussing it with others, that indicates that they are really in the nature of a classical myth. And that therefore the meaning derived from them is generally more than just the meaning of a story, but there is a deeper underlying current of insight and wisdom and inspiration there to be discovered if one takes the trouble to discover it. Of course, there are difficulties, and the main difficulty being that so many people, some of them, you know, very learned people with a great deal of knowledge of literature, when I extolled the Lord of the Rings and said, over fantasy. I thought to myself, you know, maybe I ought to study what fantasy is really all about. And the way this type of fantasy was practiced by Tolkien, it is like the key to internal insight, often of very inspiring and very consequential content. And as such, it certainly should not be dismissed, but rather should be treated with interest and reverence, maybe, if at all possible, in the fashion that one has treated and should treat the great myths of our culture. And I think we had a series here quite some time ago on various forms of mythology, but particularly my favorite, the Arthurian myths. And I would say that even as there was an exceedingly long period of history when, and I probably never phrased it quite like this, when there were two great myths that were dominating Western culture. And they were the Arthurian myth and the Bible. Now, lest you feel that I am a nasty heretic, which I am, but, and that I'm saying bad things of the Bible, it is not saying anything. Joseph Campbell, the greatest mythologist of our country, said more than once, well, the Bible is a myth. Trying to convince people that the genre of myth has many expressions and that some of them are very important and very influential. And so that we need to keep that in mind, that we need to extend the concept of myth as the summation of the gathering of tales and of often closely interconnected stories which have a deeper meaning. And that deeper meaning is not just a pseudo-history. Campbell used to tell, I heard him tell it at least 3 times, the occasion when he was, I think, before his great fame, which it really only came after he became the advisor of whoever made Star Wars, yeah, and because they sincerely wanted a big movie that would be a contemporary myth. I saw most of Star Wars, and I would say I like Tolkien better. But let's say it's true that there are important and sometimes really transcendental and spiritual truths which, since time immemorial, have been communicated generally to people in the form of myth. And this is of very great importance. So I came to the conclusion that if we are lucky, but we humans are so seldom lucky, look at it. I'm who I am. I'm just a Hungarian runaway. But I even noticed that in my by now considerably long lifetime that I participated in several great myths, and that one of these was certainly the myth of Western religion, the myth of Jesus, and that there were others. And that then came eventually came the whole mythic confusion of World War II, and before that of World War I, and that the great battles and the great terrible things that were going on, all had a mythic foundation. Ordinary, and what am I seeking for? All the prosaic stories do not make world wars. Prosaic stories will not drive millions of young men into the trenches and into the various battlefields and into death and into terrible things. It must be a story that speaks to different sides and different aspects of the human psyche, so that therefore a real myth is a psycho-spiritual modality of communication, and subsequent to the communication of inspiration. That is what makes it exciting. That's what it makes it endure. That's why people still read Homer and the Odyssey and all kinds of things, because there is something there that speaks to aspects of the human character that nothing else addresses. And that is why, for instance, the myth of Arthur, the once and future king, it's still here. Maybe it gets other names, but this was the great spiritual but not religious myth that ruled the Western world for centuries upon centuries. And I was already vaguely aware of that when I was going to school, because I was reading, some of the books on King Arthur when I was led into one of the historical buildings in Innsbruck, Austria, in the imperial palace where the emperor sometimes went, especially when there was a war or a revolution in Vienna. Then they came to Innsbruck, but if you ever go there, don't miss that. There is a fairly large circular chapel, and in the middle of the circle is a huge bronze catafalque, which is the coffin of the Emperor Maximilian I, one of the early emperors of the Habsburg. And around him, around the catafalque in a circle, stand bigger than life-size bronze statues. And each one has a little inscription. And they are the largely mythological ancestors of the Emperor Maximilian. And on this one that particularly attracted me, and then I looked and saw the Latin inscription, Arturus rex rexque quondam futurus. Arthur, the once and future king. I said, this is King Arthur. I used to go in there and to a religious statue and just sit and meditate and pray there to Arthur. Because I do think that is one of the great, overwhelmingly important and large mythic figures of our culture. And if we have any desire at all to understand our culture instead of throwing it away as we do now so often, then we should be familiar with it. In any event, so now I was diverted to Arthur, but one could be diverted to other things. I came to the conclusion in the course of my career that knowingly or unknowingly, and sometimes mistakenly, and sometimes by introducing unnecessary corruptions into them, but we live by myths. And that when we do that, like so many other things, one can live something in depth, or one can live something superficially. It's true of anything. You can have a love affair which I trust and hope that all of you have had or will, And again, you can conduct that in a kind of a low-class prosaic manner, in which it probably will not be very memorable, and when you are 90 years old, you probably won't remember it anymore, But on the other hand, you can discern something profound. You can discern some energy coming forth from your experience that you have not experienced before, and that is extremely nourishing and inspiring and transforming to the psyche, and that when you maybe stepped out of that particular thought world, something valuable, something enduring will still be with you. And that's the way we ought to lead our lives. If we lead our lives and we, I don't know, we take a trip here, we take a trip there, we listen to this politician or that politician, maybe not very long if we have any sense, and so we experienced all kinds of things, but we are not carrying anything with us. The results of these, the seeds that have been planted in our psyche by various experiences have never had the opportunity to sprout and to grow into magnificent spiritual powers. And that is why probably the very beginning of a meaningful life. This is what Carl Jung always emphasized, meaning. Of a meaningful life is to be observant on an intuitive level. What does this really mean? Why has this particular experience come to me? Why have I met such and such people who had an influence on my life? And then, of our own story, why have I met particular books which I never forgot and which brought to me a transfiguring inspiration that has remained with me into old age? Why? Because they had something. They were a real mythos, as the ancients would have called it. And that real mythos is a source of inspiration, and it transfigures your life, and it makes you aware of realities in life which ordinarily would have completely bypassed you. That is why, especially if you are dealing with children, and I never had any, but I have dealt with children and have been in circles of my extended family. That is why one should definitely inspire and cultivate and nudge the imagination of children. If children learn how to deal with their own imagination and how to derive insight from that, then the likelihood is that this talent will continue in their lives, and they will, whenever they leave this earth, they will have left it richer, more enlightened, more inspired, and perhaps will be ready, if at my age you think about those things, perhaps you will be ready by way of your enhanced imagination to walk into the greater world where imagination rules. There too, if you want to go to heaven, to use a Christian expression, it would be nice if you had some experience of heaven now, because then you won't be a stranger in a strange land. It's one way of putting it. But in any event, the imaginatio, as the old magicians, as Saint Albertus Magnus and Saint Thomas Aquinas called it, imaginatio, because it's an energy that translates itself into images. The original motion picture, perhaps, or something along that line. Because most people, at least most people I know, were not satisfied with just words or even ideas. I mean, it's better than nothing. It's better than in a bad comic book or whatever the case may be. But you like to get to a point where you're not only hearing something, where you're not only reading something, but where the image comes to you, and the image is absorbed, and that is the image-making faculty of the psyche. The depth psychologists in their own ways recognize that. You know what was the title of the journal that was published by Dr. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis? It was Imago, the image. So you see, the image and the image-making faculty is a great and wonderful talent, but of course it's perilous. Why? Because you can mistake it for all kinds of things. To make mistakes, however, is a human trait. So if you kind of sort out your experiences, say, well, maybe this is just my imagination, you know, as they put it, or maybe not, then you're that much better off. But certainly the image is very, very important. And so a myth evokes the image. Those who are interested in King Arthur and in the Round Table or in Parsifal and Lohengrin, who are sort of my heroes, because of course I also like Wagner, but in any event, if you come close to them and so that you begin, I can close my eyes and I can see Lohengrin. Now I don't know whether that's the same Lohengrin whom I saw at the opera in San Francisco, or maybe it's one that the opera inside of me had created. But it is a great and a wonderful thing. Look at all the interesting company you have when you exercise your imagination. And that is why, that and many other reasons why I'm somewhat concerned about certain trends in our culture, because we are given the images. Look at your computer, boom, there is an image. That's not my image. That's the image of the doggone piece of machinery, you know. And once again, it's not that it's not useful at its own level, but the important thing is the creativity that comes out of your psyche, no doubt brought here by various stimuli. And so this is very important. So when I was reading Tolkien, maybe for the first time through the beginning with The Hobbit, all the 4 books, I said, you know, this is a fabulous myth. And then I remember Joseph Campbell saying that what's wrong with our culture is that we have become mythless. Said, what do you mean, Joseph, mythless? Here is the greatest myth that we have seen in a tremendously long time. But I'm sure he was aware of that. So where the mythopoetic imagination is active, then you have a soul, you have a psyche that is alive. When it is not active, you have a dead soul. Even Madame Blavatsky said that there are more dead souls in this world than you would imagine, which has certain esoteric implications that we don't need to go into. But it's true that we have something within ourselves that is trying to come alive. You know, that is anxious to be with us and guide us and inspire us and give us ideas and make life more interesting. Instead of that, what do? We take that blasted telephone out of our pockets and yak. You know what? It may be useful when you want to call somebody in New Zealand, which I really haven't done in a long time, or other places, but it's not useful when it is to evoke and stimulate a certain inner being, a certain inner power, which is destined to grow into something truly wonderful and exciting and enjoyable. So with that little sermon, let's see that if we look at various portions of it, and the books are here for you to see, and especially since it's not a new book, there are always editions of the Lord of the Rings that are around. So if you do have some chance, if you have been so resistant to the new myth of the 20th and the 20th century, it's time for you now to go for the books. But in any event, let's see a little bit about that. So we'll pick various. I could narrate the story to you, but the story is so much better told by Tolkien than it ever could be by me, so that would be almost sacrilege, you know. But in any event, you know, a little of the, let's say, of the myth. Now, the myth, as certainly the Jung and the great mythologists whom he instructed, one of them being Joseph Campbell, and a number of others, some of whose name is not occurring to me, but certainly Joseph Campbell's great instructor, the German mythologist who wrote the King and the Corpse. What's his name? You can't remember. I'll dig it up again. Anyway, he died. He left from the Nazis and he died here in New York. The one who wrote Myths of India and then the King and the Corpse. In any event, you know, a lot of great mythologists who were inspired by Jung all realized that to have a myth in your life and eventually to live that myth is probably the greatest act of fulfillment of the purpose of life. Why? Because it communicates subtle and yet tremendously important and transforming and insight-producing knowing, meaning, which otherwise doesn't come to us. Money is a good thing if you have it. It's less good when you don't have it. But you know, money can buy you some things that otherwise you wouldn't have. But it can never buy meaning in your life. And I have certainly known, and you have known people who had nothing but money, and they certainly didn't have any meaning. So those things need to be kept in mind. Now, the first thing that comes to my mind, and perhaps because it came to my mind when I was reading the books, is the well, again, I need to explain a little bit. Many of you know it already, but it's another world, so to say, and it's called Middle Earth. And on this Middle Earth, there are various beings, and primarily there are four kinds of people, although some of them hardly can be called people any longer, but these beings inhabit and manage in various ways this Middle Earth. And there are 4 of them, which right away hit me. Jung has the 4 psychological types of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. I said, could there be a relationship? Well, to some extent there is. But there is an even closer relationship, which I should have thought of first, I of all people, because the 4 races, as he called it, of beings, the 4 races of beings have definitely a meaningful relationship to the types of souls that the Gnostics wrote about, and which Jung, of course, knew. So, all right, let's see what are the folk, the various folk in Tolkien. We'll start sort of, if we don't use that too badly, with the bottom, which is the dwarves. You don't need to have a very big magical imagination to realize that the dwarves are the beings of the earth. And of course they work in the earth, there are miners, they bring beautiful things out of the earth, and they definitely are greatly attached to those jewels and gold and silver, and even they even have, there is something that is the dwarf silver mithril, which is a substance much more valuable than gold, much more valuable than silver. I was looking for it, but I haven't found it yet. So, these are the earth dwellers and earth delvers, the dwarves. Then there are the humans, believe it or not, although according to sort of medieval custom, they are called men, which I'm sure the feminists and the feminazis would not be terribly happy about, but that's the original form. In German we have a Mensch, and a Mensch is a human. Mann is the male man, who however is very seldom mentioned, but the Mensch is a human. So there are the humans. So that's which there is called the men, called by Tolkien men. And then there are the elves, which is the highest echelon, the most spiritual echelon, and whom I always considered to be, in our language, more in the nature of angels. And in fact, even the movie captured some of that. I don't know, do you have any memories about the trilogy in the movie? Well, whether you do or not, I'll try to recollect it for you. There is one particular scene. It's not even such a terribly important scene in the story, where the half-elfin wizard Elrond is meeting his daughter Arwen Evenstar, and Arwen by then has fallen in love with Aragorn, the prince, and she, being a not full-blooded, but almost full, half-blooded elf, she has the choice to stay on Earth and become human, or to go back home to Elfenhome, which is a sort of heaven world beyond the oceans. And so she's in a kind of a lower area, and down the mountain comes Elrond with his retinue, and he has, I don't know how many, about 6 or 7 elves with him. And if I ever seen what I would consider an accurate depiction of angels, it is those elves that are coming down. God, these angels of heaven. So obviously the angelology of the various religions, because the Jews, Christians, Muslims are not the only ones, but well, in Islam definitely. I know Islam is not that popular now for good reasons, but the rule in Orthodox Islam, I think in both Shia and Sunni Islam, is that one of the 5 pillars of Islam, that means the 5 things that you have to believe. Of course, it begins with Allah and so forth. But one of the 5 pillars is that there are angels. That's it. If you don't believe in angels, you don't think angels are real, you're not going to be a Muslim. And at the present time, maybe you don't want to be, I don't know. But in any event, let's say the angelology is a worldwide phenomenon, and it indicates it indicates a set of beings who are almost out of manifestation. They have almost recovered their divinity. But at the same time, they have certain tasks, and among them is the guiding and the blessing of humans, and the bringing of inspiration and messages. After all, angelos in Greek means the messenger. Gabriel being probably the most, the best known in Christian angelology, because Gabriel is the one who brings the message to the Virgin Mary about the forthcoming birth of Christ. Hail Mary, says, something big is going to happen. You better shape up, girl. There he is. In any event, but it is something very angelic, and of course, particularly in the Silmarillion, you can read pages of the prehistory of these various beings, and the elves originate in a distant, mysterious, sort of semi-spiritual land beyond the ocean, Elfenhome, Eregion, and some of them, probably because they were too adventurous and didn't know any better, came to Middle-earth. And now they are kind of caught there. And whenever they hear the waves of the ocean, Legolas the elf, obviously, oh, the sea, oh, the sea to the sea. When he hears the gulls of the sea, it's really the voice of the other world, of the greater world, where we came from, and where we like to get back, but it's not that easy. So those are the elves. And let's say they are definitely, I would say they are at least semi-supernatural beings that have human characteristics. They have elfin children, but not too many, and so forth. In fact, he was just talking about Arwen Evenstar is the son of Elrond, half elfin, so she's a quarter elf by then. But let us say a very perceptive, a very spiritual, very transcendentally wise race of beings. By the way, let me flagellate the wokish world for a minute. I know for a fact, but because it happened to a friend of mine, that the Oxford Tolkien Club, after he was an Oxford student and an Oxford professor to the end, the Tolkien Club in Oxford had declared that these various divisions of being, which in Tolkien are called races, that they cannot be called races anymore. And so a number of members of the Oxford Club, including my good friend and cousin who resigned from the Alcott Club, from the Tolkien Club, and so did a number of others. I mean, this is literalism of the worst kind. This is Calvin raised to the 10th grade. And this is stupidity of the most abysmal character. And it's not the only one. Well, all right, with that little ranting and raving, I'll feel better, and we'll go on. So there are the elves, and then, of course, so we had dwarves, elves, humans, or men, and then we have a strange hybridish kind of a race, the hobbits. And Tolkien himself once said, if I had been him, I never would have owned up to it, that he, these names and the languages would come to him. And he was already a professor, and he was correcting term paper of somebody at Oxford. And so there was one student, there's always a trickster, There was one student who submitted a completely blank paper for his exam, didn't write anything. I think he didn't like the professor very much. And so Tolkien picked up this blank paper and said, well, what am I going to do with this? And then he started scribbling in a sort of like automatic writing. Although he never called it that, but he started, when he finished what he wrote, in a hole in the ground there dwelt or lived a hobbit. And these are the first lines of the book, The Hobbit. Let's say he sort of had verification for this particular name, and then the whole race of hobbits. They're probably closer to humans than any other, except that they are, they have all kinds of qualities, good qualities that humans don't have, you might say. And they are very fond of food, which is a good quality. They're very, very fond of food. They are full of comforts. They live in these nice, comfortable hobbit holes that are dug into the side of hills and so forth. I think they still have some in New Zealand from the movie and so forth. And they are sort of the embodiment of practicality, but also of good humor and goodwill. So you might almost say that a large number of human qualities which we would love to have, the hobbits got it. And largely, therefore, as we find out in the course of the books, they then begin to play a tremendously important role, because in the great task of the Lord of the Rings, which I will mention so that it does not remain unmentioned, namely the defeat of a very, very evil sort of demonic power, the Dark Lord, who in turn has a ring. And this ring is one of several magic rings, and he's trying to accumulate some others. But it is a ring that when you wear it makes you literally omnipotent, and you can do anything with a doggone thing. So let's say the recovery and the ultimate destruction of that magic ring that conveys so much evil power on Sauron the Dark Lord is accomplished by hobbits and not the heroic humans and not the elves and the dwarves either, but it's by the hobbits. And sort of I have literary criticisms and things like that coming out of my bookshelf. You know. For a while I bought every book that mentioned Tolkien. But I must say I didn't read all of them. I kept reading Tolkien. So in any event, one of the great, if you want to see, messages of the Lord of the Rings is that the practical, down-to-earth, but good-natured and kindly beings are the ones who accomplish victory in life. And that even manage to save the world, which is about to be taken off by a hold of by a demonic being, because the qualities of goodwill, kindliness, and humor qualifies us or anybody to accomplish sometimes the greatest, the most important deeds possible. So if we want to be, or whether we want to or not, or whether we come into some position in our lives of, being sort of mini saviors in some fashion, even if we are but a mini savior of an abandoned child or of a troop of abandoned dogs or something like that, then we have to have those qualities. Good people who are at the same time practical, but not often some new age. I don't know what would you call it? The eternal hunting grounds, you know, something like that. But who have a sense of practicality, but also have a sense of goodness and kindness and good behavior toward others. These are the hope of the world. All the other great ones, great magicians, great king, weren't able to do it, but the hobbits were able to do it. But that's in the story later on. But let us say those are the hobbits. So they are an endearing, and at the same time, as Gamville, the great magician, calls them, you absurd hobbits, because they have their own logic. They don't do things according to other people. So a lot of the things that they are interested in, that they like to do, appear an absurdity to outsiders. But they are not an absurdity, but they are really guided by good character and goodwill, which is, of course, extremely important. Needless to say, while you may think that you have seen an elf, it's, look at some of these up here, you know. These, let's say, angelic or semi-angelic beings, in my humble opinion, are here on earth. So are the subterraneans, particularly in the Alpine countries. You have constant writings and artwork about them, the Zwerge, as they call them in German, which is the dwarf, and that's just like Tolkien's. But when it comes to hobbits, there are probably some people who are working in that direction, people of good character and good humor and good appetite, and that's a hobbit, you know. and they don't forego any of that for any purpose, but they like it. And so these are the four races. Now, in order to maybe make this a little bit alive, we would say that when we compare this to the Gnostic typology of Valentinus and some of the other great Gnostic teachers, they had something very similar. They said that there are some small number of people who are people of the spirit, spirituales. They are still maybe in the human body, but they are already moving over into the divine, into the spiritual realm. And these are sort of the crème de la crème of humanity. Those are the elves, or at least the equivalent of that are the elves. And then we have the dwarves. Well, I would say that all the people in our culture, which are very many, who in one way or the other are running after money, running after the treasure of this world, and consider that the supreme objective of their lives, they are like the dwarves. And I don't have, I could find it's in the Hobbit, but I think that I never liked lecturers who were reading too much out of books. So I'm not, but there is a beautiful scene toward the end of the Hobbit where the king of the dwarves, who is gravely wounded in battle, is talking to Bilbo the Hobbit, who has come to help him. And I can't, I have not memorized it, but it is something like, you kindly son of the Shire, which is where the hobbits come from, who value good food and good comfort so much higher than mere gold. If only I and only my people could do that, it would be a better world. So that the orientation to ideals and the withdrawal, at least to some extent, from the interest in material things, that is what would help the. Once again, the dwarves are not bad little people, and they have the great big beards like they do in the Alpine countries and so forth, but they are definitely oriented to earthly things. They are children of the earth, but they are very good at what they do. They are tremendous silversmiths and discoverers of metals in the ground and so forth. So that's we already heard about the hobbits, who are really more like real super nice humans whom you might meet if you are very, very lucky. Because they are kindly, and they are fun-loving, and they are food-loving, and they are altogether delightful little fellows, you know. In fact, it has been said that Tolkien, being, of course, an Englishman, that he patterned the hobbits to some extent on the inhabitants of the British Isles. Well, I hope so, because they are certainly charming persons. So we got those. We got the elves. We got three. So who did we miss out on?
You have to comment on the humans.
The who?
On the humans, Tolkien's humans. Human
beings.
Oh yeah, the humans. There are humans there too. Well, hello there, yeah. Now humans are rather like humans. But on the other hand, they are also, most of them, or many of them could have stepped out of the Arthurian myths or elsewhere, because they are heroic, they are wise, and they are very, very idealistic. And so you might say if there is any movement from one race to the other, you would imagine that humans here and there might have the opportunity to change into elves, which is certainly true in the one case of Arwen Innes, who is already half an elf, so probably has an easier time. But let us say there are interconnections, even it would seem like in Arwen's case intermarriages, and that ultimately the four races, so to say, are destined to work together and to make Middle Earth a more spiritual, better place. And certainly there are many there who do so, and in the end there is definitely a great victory of the good over evil. So let us then realize that how should I put it, that the presence on earth of different soul types, just like the old Gnostics envisioned it, is an important and a useful circumstance. So we are very involved right now in weird and often incorrect interpretations of the phrase from the early documents of the Republic about all men are created equal. When I first read that, and I came to an American college, I wrote to my professor, they may have been created equal at the time of creation, but they sure are not equal now. And obviously that these things, they can be interpreted in various ways, but the problem is that, we are short and tall, we are wise and stupid and in between, we are kindly and unkindly in the other, we are very, very different from each other. And with my French friends I say, vive la différence! Because it would be a terribly dull and dull to desperation world if we were here all of us having same faces, same bodies, same hair, and so forth, and we were just here all the same. So obviously these statements were meant in certain fairly profound philosophical senses, but they are not interpreted that way by many people. And so I think what definitely the Lord of the Rings teaches us, that each in his own way, right down to the dwarfs who always go for the money. And when they said, I think some of the dwarfs incarnated in Switzerland and became bankers. But in any event, that's their nature, and within the parameters of their nature and their inclinations, they are very interesting little fellows. And so it is with others. Now, of course, there are, you say, well, what about bad people? Well, bad people as such, yeah, there are people who have been serving useful and good ends, but who have been corrupted by the influence of the Dark Lord, particularly Saruman the magician, who at one time was Saruman the White, the head of the White Council, but who eventually turned toward the evil and had completely degenerated that you don't even want to read his fate at the end. So there are all kinds, and then there are sort of malicious hybrid beings who are called the orcs, O-R-C. And these are sort of almost like a corruption of a largely human nature, and really very, very crude and nasty creatures. But they are not one of the four races. So they are there, and they become subservient to the Dark Lord and are involved in various battles. And so, incidentally, Orcus, there is a species of whale that is called orc. So I don't know whether Professor Tolkien was interested in whales or not, or if he did, then he did not have a very high opinion of the orc whale. But let us say, so there are various, and then there is a whole bunch of people. There were 7 of them at one time, but only a few are mentioned, who are the wizards. There were 7 wizards that came to Middle-earth from across the ocean, again from the mysterious world. And one of these, Gandalf, who is known at first as Gandalf the Grey, later on as Gandalf the White, is sort of the remaining wise and good wizard. And then there is another one who has gone over to the dark side, so to say. But that is a whole group in itself. So there are various things of this sort who don't fit into the 4 categories that I just mentioned. But the 4 categories, I think, as I like to contemplate regarding myths, mythological themes in general, if you cannot find the main actors, the main figures of a myth within yourself, then maybe, buddy, you got the wrong myth. Because they can. In the same way, when we look at this, I have a pretty small one because of my background, but I have a pretty small dwarf in me, and I would like to be a hobbit, but I haven't quite made it. Would require much more good Hungarian goulash and various things like that. I really don't know whether hobbits ate, but if they had come across a good Hungarian goulash, you can believe it that they would have eaten it, and so on and so forth. And as far the elf, we also all have an elfic nature, and we are moving in that direction, so that this elfic and angelic nature is within us. And if we cultivate it and we don't go against it and we keep the right company, then we will move more and more toward Elfenland, toward the glorious island in the back of the oceans where the elves still dwell. And maybe then when we go up to, Santa Monica Beach has become rather bad now in certain ways, I understand. But, anywhere there, I used to have a church in Laguna Beach years ago, so the beach is precious. If we go to these places and listen to the waves and look out at the ocean, maybe somewhere back beyond our horizon and murmuring through the waters, there is the land of the elves, Elfenhome, Erisea, the place of the wise, of the good and of the kindly elves. And maybe, if we do things right, we will be able to go there. Maybe we'll dwell there for a while, or of any of the other blessed islands that Tolkien intimates, because there is a greater, a wiser, a kinder, a more understanding nature inside of us. And when this is released, and when it is properly stimulated, then that is where we will be. So this sort of, I already noticed a lot of that, and if anybody would, when reading the Lord of the Rings without the Silmarillion, which has all the myths, and I said, he's writing about angels, he's writing about spirits, he's writing about how we may move and become like elves. And I was never disappointed with the books. So this is, I think, a good little introduction to the situation, and we'll do some with quotations, particularly of Tolkien's poems. I know a lot of people say that he was not much of a poet, but let's say the content and the way they come across, I think, is very inspiring and very beautiful, and some themes, including a return of the Arthurian theme, and that is what the return of the king is all about. So we shall look at these things in the coming months, and I'm so glad that in spite of whatever obstacles may have stood in the way, that you came, and long live the good Professor Tolkien, long live Tolkien, and may his wisdom come back and prevail in this darkened world. Thank you.